Welcome to the Nature of Things. I'm here with Siddhart, who is currently a second-year PhD student in the Electrical and Computer Engineering department at Rutgers University in New Jersey, in USA. He came to the USA in 2015 for a master's and continued to do a PhD under the same advisor. His broad research interests are in building devices for human-computer interaction, wearables, mobile health applications, interesting audio applications, and working on random things. And we're going to elaborate on what random things are for you. And he spends a good chunk of his time reading on things that are not directly related to his PhD or his area of expertise. And he believes that people need to be specialized generalists. So I think let's start from there. If you could tell us a little bit about what your overall perspective is, particularly concerning your last statement that people need to be specialized generalists. What do you mean by that?
So, I mean, if you look at it from a PhD perspective, you're sort of becoming an expert of one domain.
Yeah.
You're seeking to be a specialist, right?
Yeah.
And it's sort of shunned upon to be somebody who knows a lot of things, but not in much depth. I mean, the whole point of doing a PhD is to become the person to go to for one particular niche area.
Yeah.
And for the general public, even many people are, depending from a job perspective, they may or may not know other things, and they might only know about their particular job. So I think as an individual, just for the sake of living and for having a productive sort of life, I think people need to be specialized but generalists. In the sense, you know to do a lot of things, but you're really good at a few things.
So one of those skills that could be useful outside of academia, or of course within academia, is, for example, developing, let's say, the way you communicate with people as one of the things that extends. But because I think there's this, what you're getting to is that there's some sense of disconnect between, you becoming an expert in your field and the way, let's say, not only related to your work, but being able to communicate with people, even being able to communicate your research, skills that will benefit your career. But not only that, just having a broad range of interests in different topics could also be a way. Like if you think about it in a pragmatic way, it could be like you could study other areas to help you gain more insights into your own research.
I mean, one example would be, let's take machine learning, right?
Yeah.
People know these toolboxes or frameworks or functions, let's say in Python.
Yeah.
And maybe they know something in Theano or Cafe or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But not many people know the math behind it, or how that particular algorithm is implemented.
Yeah.
That would be one step. Another step is maybe they do know about writing stuff in Linux. Maybe they don't. Maybe they know how to do some embedded programming. Maybe they don't. But the point is, if you sort of pigeonhole yourself, it gets really hard to divert later on, or to sort of compete even, right? Because there's always the new kid on the block who probably has more time than you to spend on something and get better than you in your own domain.
Yeah, I see your point. So you'd have the skill sets to, or you develop the necessary skills to transition into new areas as well. Because I think that's also part of research, in a sense that you can apply your skill sets as well into different domains, because the fields are always changing, right? And I think it will help you, because if you spend so much time studying, researching, writing papers around a certain topic, if it's image recognition within a specific domain, it's likely that you might get bored after doing this for a long time, or you want to move on to something new. And then the transition is, of course, easier if you do it gradually rather than just switching to a completely different domain. So what you're saying is, as you're progressing with your research, you also take the time to learn and develop other skills that could be useful for you later on.
True. And one of those things would be that you mentioned, right? Communication. It's knowing how to present slides. It's knowing how to speak with people.
Yeah.
It could also be knowing how to do research or reading papers from other domains or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And generally to be a more rounded person, because people have this feeling that people who do PhDs are not rounded individuals, that they might lack certain social skills, they might lack certain other technical skills.
Definitely. That's a very interesting topic. I saw was it I think it was like a documentary of it was a Swedish television that broadcasted this documentary about global warming, and how there's a disconnect between what people actually believe and what researchers or let's say the combined minds of experts in the area believe or hold as scientific, the standards, that what's acceptable. And there was this people talking who are not scientists by nature. They don't have the in-depth expertise of these areas, but what they do have are excellent communication skills.
Yeah.
So what's going on is that somehow these people are able to convince the public, let's say, or others, that the information that they believe is right or correct is the truth, because they're just so good at communicating it in an appealing way. Whereas, a scientist who is an expert in that domain might not have, let's say, I'm not generalizing, but maybe it's more likely that that person doesn't have the necessary public speaking skills to communicate why this is an important issue and why this is an issue in the first place, and what we could do to, address it or work on making Earth more sustainable, because a scientist would likely lose that argument simply because of the lack of communication skills, not because of the lack of having the expertise in the area,
And to me, another thing that I've noticed is when it comes to topics like this, the scientists still have the door open for saying maybe we don't understand something well enough, and people don't like that. So if you go up to somebody and say, hey, I've built this machine and it works 99% of the time, for the scientist, that's a really good result. But to a layperson, they're like, but there's still that 1% chance. Right. And when I guess the public doesn't like that. Right.
Yes,
and
definitely.
when somebody says, hey, this is 100% foolproof solution, and they say that with confidence, you're more likely to believe them than somebody who says, hey, my model or my estimate might be off by a bit.
And I believe that's that's a global problem. Because you can be convincing. I mean, it's like with sales. People can sell you crap, but they're just good at. They're just excellent sellers. So, they somehow manage to convince you, even if it's total crap. And I think it's the same analogy. I mean, that holds as an analogy to this in a way, because the people who are able to speak without having the necessary scientific backing are sort of
more convincing.
Yes, seem more convincing because they are able to pitch it in a way that sounds appealing to the public. I mean, and that's a skill in itself. And I think perhaps I'm not sure what a plausible solution would be to that, but I think maybe generally it could be more encouraged maybe within the scientific community to sort of exert their influence or their expertise outside of academia. I mean,
I think it's also to do with the fact that many academicians approach things with a condescending tone or a tone of superiority, which lay people inherently don't like. Because I've noticed that some people don't like explaining things in the most simplest way possible, right? People still like throwing jargon around to sort of show or demonstrate that, hey, we know these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And salespeople don't do that, right? Salespeople are really basic, really rudimentary, really simple language to understand.
Definitely.
And that gets through so much more easily.
Yeah, that does indeed, because you don't need to. I mean, just understanding these complex subjects in depth requires years of training, and to get to that point where I want to get to is it's not about having the answer.
Right.
It's about having a conversation about the problem. I think that's sometimes it's not about the solution to global warming should be X and Y. No, it should be more about, can we have a discussion about can we have a continuous discussion and sort of find a way to iterate forward and see if we can make a difference. But we cannot, of course, say for certain that this is the right way to address this problem, because it's a very complex problem, and it's
and
likely
one
to be
solution that works somewhere might not work another place.
No, but so if a scientist goes out and says that well, this is what our understanding is at the moment, this is the related work in this area, and we agree on certain things, we don't agree on other things, it's likely that it's this way, but it's also we can't say for certain because this matter at hand is very complex. and then maybe people would be like, what
What does that even mean, right?
Yeah, what is that? Can you, like, you're the expert, you should be telling us the answers. What is it like? But I think that sort of, to get to that point also is part of the PhD training in itself. That's why it's so esoteric. I mean, science in itself, because even scientists don't understand other scientists' work to some degree. I mean, it's just complicated. And
I always wonder about that, right? When you write your paper in and you send it out for peer review, if everybody's doing new work and sort of pushing the envelope, then how can you be certain that whoever's reading your paper really understands what's going on? Because sometimes you get these paper reviews from 4 or 5 people and they're like, at least 1 or 2 are not from your area, and they sort of choose to give you an accept or a reject based on nothing, right? I mean, if you're not from the area.
I think that's a very difficult, if you say, okay, what would be the alternative to that? Because I think that might be, it's distributed among X number of reviewers, and I suppose many of them are doing what they can to give you, like, if someone would have to review your papers, it has to be other researchers in the, who else? But also I think, of course, there's a problem that comes from a lack of understanding in general, I think, and so but this is also happening. I mean, this just happens. It's throughout history. You can just handpick scientists who have had their work rejected but turned out to be seminal papers. Like that happens. So what can you do about it? Like,
so that's where it sort of ties back to the point that you were saying earlier, right? Like, how do you educate lay people to sort of understand what science or where science is coming from? Because the more and more recent the research work is, the more and more there is to learn or read up to sort of catch up to that point. So if you're a lay person who wants to get into, let's say, semiconductors or something, if you have to catch up on 50 years worth of work before you can get to this point, somebody who's not doing that really has no idea about the area. And they're not even ready to have that discussion. So suppose, let's say, environmental science, right? You want to talk about global warming. If your high school student or somebody who turned 18, who has the right to vote, does not know how to speak the language in which the information is being given, then you're going to have a problem or a disconnect. Right?
Indeed,
So that's another way of sort of tying it back to being a specialized generalist, where people have a minimum level of IQ or a minimum level of understanding of things, so that they're able to understand what's being said, but they don't need to be a specialist.
Yeah, that is a public, I think that's a public problem in the sense. I think that's why I really have a strong, I'd say I have a strong opinion when it comes to having a well-educated public, or having, raising or making education more accessible. For example, if you don't go to college, then it's less likely that, of course, you'd understand some of these topics, and most people, I would say, I'm not sure about, but many people wouldn't even know where to start because they have not been introduced at all to these fields. And unfortunately, there's this, what I think media portrays is, or at least media gives a lot of time and gives a platform for people who are well known in the public, not necessarily people who are within research, but it could be celebrities, or it could be, to speak out on these topics that are so complex. That I feel like it's not about, what your feeling is towards a particular subject, or it's more about, I think, the actual science, the actual research and development behind it. And if you don't have that expertise, then you cannot really say, I don't know, my feeling is that, or
at that point it's just like what you flip a coin, right?
yeah, you flip a coin.
Conjecture.
Yeah,
it's conjecture.
yeah, and of course that's why, I mean, scrutiny happens all over the media all the time, because of people making statements that are not factually, well backed up, or clearly referenced. But it's also that many of the people who talk about some of these topics are just people who, like, the public can relate to.
Yep.
I mean, after all, there's, I think, around maybe 1% of the population who decide to do a PhD. In general, we are not relatable people.
I think that's part of the reason that you join a PhD, right? Because you are not able to relate to others as well.
Yeah. So,
because my favorite expansion of PhD is person with head damage.
Yeah,
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So and also I like to extrapolate a bit on this, and say, science itself is becoming increasingly specialized. You could, if you go back in history, you could bring, you could talk about people who had, were polymaths, or had their fingers in different domains and made significant contributions in, different domains, or within the same domain, but they're all like very significant. And these days it's I think, because it's becoming so much more specialized, that it's becoming also increasingly difficult to communicate the science itself.
True.
I think so. And it's also becoming increasingly, it puts more pressure on education, because you have to to be able to advance the state of the art, you have to
catch up to the state of the art.
You have to catch up to it, yeah. And so there are these concerns, I think, within the educational, like this, like that really puts pressure on this system itself to sort of, or the people who are responsible within, giving out programs, that, how do we adapt this to, this specific field, and how do we make sure that the people who go through these programs can get enough, or learn enough about the field to be able to make, tangible contributions, or have the potential to do so.
Yep.
So
and that's one place where I find that even for PhDs, it's like jobs now, right? I mean, if you want to get into a top tier university to do a PhD, it's not accessible to your average Joe. It's like remarkable people get to go to remarkable places and then work. Similar to where you need to have some job experience to get your first job. But even if it's a starting job, without that, you have no job experience, right? So it's like the chicken and egg problem. So for PhDs, I find the same thing, right? If you want to get into a good lab, work with a good advisor, then they're going to ask you, what previous experience do you have?
Yeah.
And unless you go to that place, you can't start off to get that experience. So it's, unless you find someone to sort of teach you or guide you, it's hard to access this PhD world to begin with.
Definitely. I could say that I wasn't even considering this trajectory. I mean, for me, it started just by, I just dropped an email to the professor. I was taking a course, and
Yeah, that's how it happened to me as well.
uh,
But then I had to do a project as part of the course, which was sort of where he vetted us to see, okay, do I want to continue working with this student?
mhm.
But that still means that I had to do something before I could join his group. It
Definitely,
wasn't
yeah.
like you say, hey, I'm interested in this, these are my grades, can I join? It's I don't I'm seeing less and less of that, is what I'm trying to say.
Mm. Makes sense. There are some fields that are just, well, I guess getting into a top PhD program is competitive. I mean, very competitive in itself. So of course, the statistic of the PhDs compared to the number of faculty positions available, and how hard it is and how much more competitive it is to get into those positions. And so that, of course, trickles down into the advisors in a way that they feel maybe we need students who can produce.
Produce good work and like a lot of work.
Yeah, and the more this thing, I think, somehow, I don't know how this would be regulated, but I think there has to be some. I mean, this can't keep going. I mean, this can't keep. This is going to put more pressure on the next generation of people coming up. It's going to get much more challenging unless this whole system is diversified in some sense, or yeah. I wouldn't know where to begin to speculate about this, but I think there has to be, I mean, graduating students are not looking for, many more are looking for alternatives. It's just, you can't go in with the assumption of thinking that you'll become a professor anymore, or these days. So, but going back to what you said about getting into a PhD position in the first place, several of the people I talked to who got into their positions didn't even consider going to a PhD. They just sort of learned the ropes and found research to be fun, and they found a set of people who encouraged them to do research, and they got into that, and now they're doing it. And some people may have, others may just have come from an academically oriented family where it's just, of course, you have to do research. It's your grandfather did research, you should do research. But
in which case they already have that framework, right? They sort of already know.
Yeah.
And there's somebody to teach them the ropes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's not just the work itself. It's also, I think it's the work itself is, there's the research, but what's, even more, what to say, tangible or substantial is the mentality. I mean, the way you sort of approach and unravel problems, and the way you ask questions, and like having that academic oriented mindset is, or just being generally curious
Right.
about trying to figure out things. This kind of drive, I think, is what drives people, I guess, who are passionate about something into research. And not necessarily they have to be I mean, even if you're the smartest guy in the world, you won't be able to. I mean, if you don't have the patience to do it, you won't be able to do it.
You won't be able to produce anything meaningful.
Yeah. So I think also the having a track record of peer-reviewed papers, or doing research work before, also shows that potential. I think that you are inclined towards research, or you're interested in doing research.
Right.
So yeah. But for example, if you're doing machine learning, then I mean, I've seen crazy things that people actually have multiple publications in top ML venues during the bachelor's before they enter into a PhD program. Yeah.
I've sort of seen that transition in the last 5 years. So when I applied to come for a master's after my bachelor's from India, I didn't have a publication, right? And I had a vague idea as to what research could be, because of an internship that I did in my last year of bachelor's.
Mm.
But other than that, I didn't even have a taste of what research is or what it could be. Right? And definitely nobody pitched it to me saying that you get to use your mind to just solve problems. Right?
Mm.
At the end of the day, it's just solving problems that you think are interesting to you and which might have an impact.
Yeah.
Right. So when I applied for a master's program here, I found out that since I didn't have any publications, here being US, I was at the short end of the stick because people were publishing not so great work during bachelor's in India, and they still got to show that as some inclination for research, and they got into better schools.
Yeah.
And that was just a means to an end for them to get into a better school, and then they just got jobs right after their master's degrees.
Yeah.
And after coming here, I spent about a year trying to find a professor, trying to understand what research is. And then, as you said, the rest was you sort of slip into this track because you just like the way it works, or you like working on stuff that you want to work on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, more and more people are informed these days from a bachelor's level. More and more research is accessible, but that's sort of coming back to the point that if you don't follow a certain path from an early enough age, then you're not going to get to the place that you would want to.
That's true. And maybe that's creeping down to lower in the
right.
lower and lower in the food chain.
Right. So like, I mean, one example is if you look at athletes, suppose the best NBA player or the best skier or the gold medalist or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Or cricket in India, those people start pretty young, let's say 5-10 years old. Earlier it used to be 15, 16, and now that's sort of come down to like 10, 11, 12.
Yeah.
And I think once these domains start saturating, it'll be similar for PhDs as well. Like if you want to get into a particular program, you have to get into a particular university, and then to get into that particular university, you have to train and then get ready and stuff. So like you said, that's just going to keep pushing downwards, right?
Yeah. I think that's going to happen, and maybe in the future it's likely that we might see research oriented high schools.
But I mean, in one sense it's nice that you have these structures in place, but in the other sense it's sad where some people are sort of late bloomers, if you want to call it, right? I would consider myself to be one of those, where being a year or two into my PhD is when I'm sort of finding the steam or finding my place. And when I was still doing my master's, I was still finding my footing, right? But if those opportunities were not given to me, to somebody like me, and they were only given to somebody who had shown results, then I wouldn't be here. Not that I'm saying that I'm doing great research, but even the opportunity to do research would not be presented.
But not only that, it's also that just because of the pressure to publish, and that's increasing just within the last few decades. It's like if you want to go proceed towards an academic position, it's likely that you take less risks within research, if that makes any sense. Like you meander less because you feel like you have to publish, and so you stick with the things that you know are going to give you the results. And I sort of feel like that's, I mean, if you want to be like, have this ideological or like philosophical perspective to it, I think that's, some of the research, I mean, research in itself is about exploration. A large portion of it is about exploration, and if you have too much pressure, you won't be able to take the risks that you might need to take to make groundbreaking discoveries. So I feel that maybe in some sense this system is proceeding to put boundaries on itself.
So there was this article I was reading the other day, and it was talking about the medical community. I wanted to bring this up because COVID-19 is sort of current at this point. So so this is back to the mid 80s when there was this doctor researcher who found out that a couple of his patients were dying of an unknown virus. And then he sort of found out that that was HIV.
I see.
And this is mid 80s, right?
Yeah.
And he wanted to explore more and do research and sort of figure out what this virus is and what it's doing. But he was actively shunned because there was no money in that area.
Yeah.
And people were not looking into this new virus, which was HIV. But then he persisted. And then when it became a highly big blown deal in the US, at least around the mid 80s to the late 80s, and then funding came in, he was in the right position to sort of capitalize on that.
Yeah.
And something similar happened with the coronavirus thing as well, where you had one of these pandemics before, but then there was no funding afterwards because who would spend billions of dollars on a pandemic that may or may not happen, right? And it's similar for technology as well, as you were saying. Right now, the buzzword is machine learning, so a lot of energy and time and things are being poured into it. Maybe there's something else out there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. That is, I guess that's something that extends to many. I mean, it extends beyond research, of course. It's also, within companies. I mean, if you think it from like a return investment kind of perspective, people wouldn't invest in, I don't know, risky ventures. Maybe some will because they believe in the cause. Like if you're doing something related to space, then it's maybe highly risky, but it might be something you still want to invest in because it's something that we should be doing. We should be building rockets and so yeah, I totally understand that. I think that's something with that maybe researchers are more feeling let's say confined or
So I mean, one way to combat that as a researcher, if somebody is a PhD student, is to sort of have a wacko sort of project on the back burner that you sort of visit once every week or something, that is ridiculous, and you don't really tell your advisor that you're working on it, because if you tell him, then he's probably going to tell you not to do that. But you work towards it until you get some results, and then maybe approach your advisor and say, hey, this was something that I was doing off the books on my own time, and maybe it's worth pursuing. I mean, that's one way I think this problem of not being risk taking enough can be addressed. But again, that's a personal thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. I heard about I heard about those kind of scenarios from other students who have been some even got into intense arguments with their advisor because they just didn't follow what they were proposing. So in the end, it's like this balance of making your advisor happy and also sort of experimenting a little bit, doing a little bit of crazy stuff. As long as you can move and progress your project forward.
So it's not a lot of time, right? I mean, since you know that it's like a Hail Mary, right? It's like a 1 in 100 thing. You just spend some amount of time sort of figuring out what these problems are, and that sort of also helps to sort of widen your area, because as you were saying, right, you get a PhD if you want to go into teaching, or if you want to go into academia, then you don't want to be competing in the area that your advisor is in, right? Because the funds are limited, and if you're from his group, then you're fighting with somebody who's got 10-15 years of experience. But if you have this other area which is sort of new, which is sort of risky, then you still have a chance of making your own name, or coming up with something that's interesting or different.
See, but that could also be that the advisor is aware of that. I mean, I suppose they could be aware of this and maybe don't want to compete with their students. So maybe they just likely to want you to work on things a bit differently, just because of sort of helping you to establish your name.
That too. No, but the other work that I was saying is more towards working on it till you get some results and then showing it to your advisor. As opposed to telling them beforehand that, hey, I'm going to go on this ridiculous, highly improbable thing, and I'm going to spend and waste some time and money on it. as opposed to that, I mean, if people always like seeing good results or some good news.
Mm.
So if you're able to show some initial sort of results, then
Yeah,
it's likely that your advisor might back you as well, right?
yeah, that's
Because
true.
they might know something more, and
That's
then
true.
they could probably shape that.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. The- it's interesting. I wanted to sort of go back a little bit to when you mentioned having a breadth
Right.
of areas where you are knowledgeable in. Uh, I want to let's say I act a little bit, like devil's advocate here, and just say, oh, okay, but do you think there's a distraction like that might detract you from what you should be doing and the effort you should spend working on the things that progresses your area forward? Or maybe you should spend more time learning about that so you can compete with other researchers who are working very hard. And maybe you need your brain to be focused on, or maybe you don't have a choice. I don't know.
I mean, I guess it also depends on personality, right?
Yeah.
If you take a look at somebody like Jan LeCun,
Hmm.
who's the Facebook AI director,
Yeah.
he's been doing machine learning, purely machine learning or deep learning. That most of the domain is the terms that he's coined or research that he's done. He's been doing that since the mid 80s.
Yeah.
Right? And to get to that level, you need that kind of concentration and focus. There's no question about that. Right? Like there's only one Michael Jordan, or there's only one Jan LeCun, or there's only one Einstein.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you as an individual sort of figure out that you want to be somebody like that, then yes, you need intense focus in that particular niche area
Mm.
where you're the 0.0001% of that field.
Yeah.
But personality wise, if you would like to enjoy a lot of things and discuss a lot of things, then there is some value in sort of spreading your energies. Because competing on that level with those people is really difficult, and that takes complete dedication, right? That sort of swallows your life.
Yeah.
Or it is your life at that point.
Mm.
So that's why I was saying that it's better to be a specialized generalist where, let's say in my case, if I'm doing hardware, I might do some antenna work, and I might do some Bluetooth low energy stack work, and then maybe do some 3D printing or CNC milling.
Mm.
And maybe combine that with something from, let's say, microfluidics or something. So if you take these skills that are not really combined usually, you can make something that's sort of rare, and then you become that rare commodity, in which case you become priceless.
Definitely.
Which has a greater probability of success, because you don't need to be the best of each of those fields. You only need to be better than most people in those fields.
I see. Yeah, that's the trade-off, right? You could, I mean, but it's also, I think it's also a bit unfair to compare these 0.001% to, I mean, there are a lot of people who are putting intense focus into research and might not get the same outcome.
Right.
Then you sort of start to question, why am I spending my life doing this? Like it becomes, because if one thing totally consumes your life and your mind, and everything else just sort of becomes less important, then you really don't want to fail in this thing that you're putting so much time and effort into, like, because that has to be meaningful. It has to, and so what you're saying is also maybe better for mental health, general mental health.
That's why I said personality, right? I mean, at the end of the day, each person has to gauge for themselves how they would like to spend their time and energies. So from a mental health perspective, and also from
but also also these people that you mentioned, like Einstein and Jan LeCun and Jeffrey Hinton and that class of people, they were also pioneers in their fields, and it's just a fundamental difference there, right? Just going out in the unknown and not knowing whether this is going to
work or not. So they probably had to grapple with those questions, right? Like, I'm putting my life into this. am I really going to see something come out of it, or how do I live with myself if something doesn't work out?
Or maybe they don't think like that at all. Maybe it's just, maybe Einstein was just like, I want to know how this works. Like, I just want to know. I don't have, so it's just a frustration. It's just this built up, like you have to know, nothing else. You just have to know. And even if you figure out that you can find an answer, it's still somehow there's some satisfaction into it because
you're just happy that you spent time working on that, right?
Yeah.
And that's another point that I wanted to sort of bring about, is that we don't look at negative results in the academic community as well as we look at positive results. When most of the results we produce are things that this does not work.
Yeah, that's right? True. That's
because another... if someone were to sort of make a book of things that doesn't work, that would save a lot of people a lot of time than if people just made a book of things that worked.
Yeah, I have to say I agree to some extent, but I also understand why it's not the case. I mean, so first of all, because you have such a large pool of mistakes, right, how would you quantify, mistakes? How would you present mistakes, and how would you sort of you need to sort of find a nice way to communicate or make it accessible for researchers to find out what they should not be doing.
Sure. That's a nice research question.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult, very challenging general problem.
Maybe people can add an appendix to their paper, because usually when a paper is written, it's written in the way like, we knew this from hindsight and we went about doing this correctly from day one and from step one.
Yeah.
Like if you read a conference paper, it's like introduction, these are the problems, related work, this is why this problem is not answered, our method, some evaluation, these are the experiments we conducted, and here are the results, and this is what we did.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's never like that, right? Yeah. You do like 10,000 different things, and then you sort of somehow manage to find a result, and then you stitch a story around how you got to that result.
Yeah, it would be nice. I think it would be nice, while it would add much more work to document all the mistakes and to put them on the paper.
Right. but there is some value there.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. If people take the initiative to document their mistakes,
not even mistakes, I would say just dead ends, right? You say, okay, this was the idea that we wanted to follow, and then these were some experiments we conducted, and these were some results we got.
Yeah, but you have to make
do that.
Yeah, you have to make a concrete analysis too. Like you have to add an analysis to it that. Right. What is the problem? Is it why didn't this work? Was it because of the question was posed in a way that we couldn't simply just wasn't possible by nature, or where is the actual dead end? Is it just that the experiments we empirically show that this is doesn't agree with our hypothesis or
something? Yeah.
So some form of analysis.
Yeah. Some of those good papers do touch upon that in the evaluation, where there's usually one or two lines where they say, this is what we thought intuitively would happen, but it did not happen.
Yeah.
And that's why we're proposing this, which is again non-intuitive, but this works. So some of those fundamental things, I'm not really sure based on what threshold or based on what context, but if they could write that, okay, these were some things that we looked at.
Yeah. There's also these papers that are, the papers that are more like challenge papers, or that bring up the limitations of existing systems, sort of highlight the kind of areas we could be useful to look into, and in some way that similar to
or a survey paper.
Survey paper. Yeah. I definitely think that those are valuable for that, in that respect. Just sort of highlighting, these are the problems that might be useful for the community to look at, and and this is the current state of things, and these are the limitations.
Right.
So I think I think those are that's very useful kind of work. I wanted to move on a little bit and bring up just ask you a bit about your experience, because you grew up in India, and
Right.
then you moved to the US, and so I know there's a large influx of people from India going to the US. So maybe you could explain a little bit more, about how that works, and how come so many people just decide that they want to go to the US. And
I see.
Yeah.
From a high level view, sort of, if
Yeah.
you wanted me to start,
Mm.
typically people migrate for better opportunities. It could be standard of living, it could be work that they want to do, it could be to pursue some opportunities or education that's not available in your country.
Yeah.
And I think most of those things are available in India, present day India, but the demand to supply ratio is sort of very skewed towards demand.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of intelligent people, but they don't have opportunities to hone their skills or to go to institutions. It could be academic institutions or government jobs or even private companies, because there isn't that sort of demand from their side, from the side of employment, I mean. But whereas the supply is really quite a lot. So in my case, let's say I graduated from my bachelor's in 2015.
Mm.
And if I wanted to look for a job in ECE and I wanted some company that did electronics,
Yeah.
there were none. And this is 2015 India, right?
Mm.
And whichever companies were there were international companies, let's say Schneider Electric,
Yeah.
or Siemens, or some other international companies which sort of invested in India, and they need only 5 or 10 people per year.
Yeah.
But my program had 500 students from ECE.
I see. So you're saying also that there's a strong competition for these positions as well. And
so it's almost like a process of elimination rather than a process of selection. So just to give you some numbers, right? People talk about IITs, the Indian Institute of Technology. They take in about 10,000 students every year. But close to, when I wrote the exam, it was about 500,000 people wrote the exam for 10,000 seats.
That's pretty crazy.
Right? And of the 10,000 seats, some of them are newer colleges. And in those ranking lists, you want to get into the top, let's say, 4 or 5 universities. So if you wanted to say, let's say, if you want to get into computer science in IIT Bombay, you would have to be in the top 50 in the country, right? If you were general category. Again, there's another process of quotas for general category and people belonging to other backgrounds. So based on that, you have to get a particular rank. So it's next to impossible, right? So imagine being in the top 50 out of 500,000 people. And that number only goes up.
But how much of that is determined by chance, in the sense?
I think a good amount of it is chance, but a much bigger chunk of it is just pure hard work and dedication and natural talent and some amount of luck.
So is it true that these tests are taken, or you start to practice for these tests very early on?
Right. So like we were talking earlier, right, that the more you sort of find out that you need to specialize, then the bottom sort of keeps going down. People start from 6th, 7th grade, depending on which part of the country you're at. So people prepare for the entrance exam to get into a coaching institution, which will prepare you for the entrance exam to get into this university.
I see.
So you have these coaching centers which specialize in training students to crack the exam to get into these IITs or NITs. There are a bunch of national level entrance exams. Yeah. And there are coaching institutions which help you sort of prepare for those exams. And those coaching institutions don't want anybody but the best. So they have entrance exams. So it's like it's stacked, right? So, but moving forward, you do all of that. You get into an engineering college, and then if you do computer science, you're good, right? Because there's a pretty big demand for IT solutions. So when I graduated in 2015, most of the employment was from these IT sourcing companies like Infosys, Wipro, Cognizant, maybe you've heard of,
Yeah.
or Tata Consultancy Services. Right?
Yeah.
Most of those people provide back-end support to MNCs in the US or around the world. And what they do is, irrespective of which background you're from, so you could be from biotechnology, you could be from mechanical engineering, they provide you coaching for about 6 months and teach you C, C++, Java, and then they give you on-the-job training, and then you get to work for that company.
I see.
And if you didn't know beforehand that, okay, I'm doing ECE and I want to get into electronics and I want to build robots and stuff, and if you had a nose for figuring out which companies hire and where to approach for placements, then you're sort of stuck. Because if those, so in India, the way it works is the companies come to the university and they have this really big career fair sort of a thing where they interview students on the campus.
Yeah, that's pretty common, I guess. I mean, around the world.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that and that happens over a period of, let's say, 6 months. It's like a whole semester long thing. Sometimes 2 or 3 semesters. Right? And if you don't get a job there, within those, and these jobs, they don't pay a lot in terms of dollars, but that they pay decently enough to live in India. If you wanted a number, I think they pay around, at least when I was graduating, they paid around 360,000 rupees or 400,000 rupees per annum. That comes to about $5,000.
I see.
So 5,000, 50,000, 50 times 70 is 350. Yeah, about $6,000 per annum, right?
So that's an entry level. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And most of those people do get a chance to, some of those people do get a chance to come to the US to work on site in the companies here for the same company. So yeah, I mean, if you're not from a particular background and if you haven't decided beforehand as to what you want to do and where you want to get a job, the only options that one has is either you apply for a government job, where again, you have these entrance exams for these different departments, or you go in for an MBA, which is mostly what most of my friends did, or you go for a master's, where again, you have another entrance exam on the national level to get into universities to do a master's. Or you write the GRE, TOEFL, and then you come to the US or go to some other country.
I see.
Now, the sad part is it's been 5 years since I've come here. Not a lot of that has changed. It's the job prospects aren't much better. Like when I was talking to juniors or talking to people who were finishing their undergraduate, the companies which used to come to recruit then are the same. The roles that they come to recruit for are also similar.
Yeah.
So there's a lack of, let's say,
diversity in terms of the kind of skills that I mean, it's sort of, you're not really applying the skills that you're trained to.
Right. That's one.
Yeah.
Two, there aren't opportunities, like there is no company that does different things, right? I mean, so let's take Apple, right? If you want to make an Apple phone, you would need software engineers, you would need fabrication engineers, you would need tooling engineers, designers. Like there's this whole ecosystem of engineers or ecosystem of people that's required.
Yeah.
But since we don't have manufacturing in India, most of these jobs are not there, which means people move towards the service sector.
So is that what Google is doing, for example, in India too? I mean, because they do have I mean, if you're in, I suppose if you're in Bangalore, then you have several of these tech companies, their presence. And let's say you go get a job at Google, you'd expect that to be more service-oriented kind of job, rather.
That I think would be more support than development sort of jobs.
I see.
Like my friends who work here, let's say in banks or in other like even Google or Barclays or Bank of America or Eaton or some other companies, right? Their support is in India. So the quality assurance and testing and stuff gets done there. But a bigger chunk of development gets done in the US. So even people in, let's say, companies like VMware or Oracle, there is development being done, but not to the level that is done in the US.
I see. So that means that sounds like US is the place to be if you want to work in development or advancing.
Right. If you want to do new things.
Yeah. I see.
So that's one reason why you find a lot of students coming to the US. One, to sort of, if they can afford it, right? Because it is an expensive ordeal. Paying even state tuition fees in the US is pretty costly if you're earning in rupees and you have to spend in dollars. And I think it does come from a place of privilege where you're able to afford this education, number one. Two, you have the opportunity to communicate and sort of write statement of purpose, write your GRE in TOEFL, and get competitive points on them to be able to apply to these universities.
Yeah, I see.
What else?
But maybe more specifically in your case, because you mentioned that you wanted to do more electrical engineering kind of work, and you found out that the opportunities for you were limited in India, so you went to the US because just of the breadth of opportunities within that area. And so, but that's also like a big step to take. I mean, to sort of move away from the things you're familiar with, and was that a no-brainer to you, or did you have second thoughts? And
there was actually a mixture of things. So I don't think it's non-existent EE, because India does develop a lot of electronics indigenously.
You do have on semiconductor, you do have these microchip companies in India, right? Too, like
right.
that.
Yeah, but I don't know if we have a fabrication house in India.
Okay.
Because last time I checked, this was some time ago, I remember that you need electricity 24/7.
Yeah. And
that was some problem, and they couldn't get a clean room set up. So they weren't able to have a fabrication house in India, but that could have changed. My information might be dated.
I see.
And there are a lot of startups which do a lot of EE stuff, and there's a lot of robotics and automation things that are going on now. But I didn't do my research as well back then, and things were a lot different. I've realized 5 years ago, like a lot has changed since I moved here. But coming back to your question, my options were, like I said, either apply for a government, apply for the exam for a government job, the Indian Civil Services, which is ridiculously competitive. Apply for getting into MBA program, which is fairly competitive, but I did fancy my chances. Because the structure of it is that they look at how much percentage of what your GPA was in your 10th grade exams. They also take into consideration what your GPA was in your 12th grade exams. They also look at your GPA through undergraduate, bachelor's, and they look at the entrance exam scores, and then they have a in-person sort of interview. So, and it's mostly math and English that's there on the entrance exam. So for the MBA school entrance exam, I did fancy my chances. But would you want to consider yourself? So the thing, like, how much were? So, I think personally, I think it's a privilege to be able to have the chance to pursue something you're interested in the first place. Some people, let's say, could you imagine yourself doing an MBA if you had that offer, let's say? Being in the position that I am right now, I would say no. I have way too much fun in what I'm doing right now. And I was a completely different person, right? 5 years ago. And I think a good part of my mental development, being able to empathize, being able to see, being able to understand, or read between the lines, is because I'm pursuing a PhD.
Mm.
There's this amount of critical thinking that I've developed now, and like I was saying, right, I'm some sort of a late bloomer in some of these aspects, where there are some talents, but honing those talents has happened in the recent past.
Yeah, yeah. That.
And the exposure is, I think, what's helped the most.
Mm.
It's really opened my eyes.
So, what are your plans then? Where do you want to go from? Have you had any idea?
So from
Yep.
here,
Yeah.
I would ideally like to get an academic position because I like teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing that uh, I liked about doing a PhD, which
Yeah.
I think a lot of PhD students don't like doing. They don't like teaching.
Yeah.
They think that spending time with their TA assignments is a big time sink,
Yeah.
which is not really rewarding because nobody cares if your students do well.
Mm.
That's not a metric in which you're judged, right? Like you could be the best TA and you could change somebody's life, but your advisor doesn't care.
Yeah.
Because if you don't publish the paper on time, then uh, it's not rewarding in that sense. But I like teaching. I've been teaching for the past 4 years now, and it was really nice to see that I started teaching in 2016. So the first batch of students that I taught graduated this year, and in some senses I feel happy, and in some senses I feel sad for them that it's 2020 and they have to finding jobs. But I taught them, I teach freshmen introduction to computers, so it's basically their first programming course, and a couple of my students got into Google. So it
Yeah.
feels nice to look back at it and think that, hey, I taught them how to program to begin with, and now they're at Google, right?
Yeah.
Which means they're much better programmers than I am right now.
Mm.
And that gives me a lot of satisfaction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those are some connections that you make for life, right? I mean, if they see me at the cafeteria or whatever, I can still sit down, have a chat with them, find out what's going on in their life. Maybe not now, maybe 10, 20 years down the line, we still have some connection, some bond, where you're like, hey, I went to this guy's class. It could be positive, it could be negative, but there's still that connection, right?
I see. So that's something I heard from something that professors like to talk about, actually, is the development. I think that's like maybe more so than even the research, and to some extent, to see your students grow and watch the things, like, because ideally you want the people you teach to grow and become better than you. Like that's the whole point. That's how you advance. but I think it's very I can understand that it's very rewarding to see people you mentor grow,
Right.
whether it's in research or it's in the industry, or in any aspects of life. I think you had an influence into
Right.
their
And
way
I
of thinking.
and that's one reason that I want to go into academia is you're like a group, right? At that point, suppose you hire these 2 or 3 students and you work with them for 4 to 5 years, if not more. And it's typically when somebody's in their mid 20s or early 20s. So that's probably the best years of their life as well.
Mm.
And if you're able to have some sort of an impact on them in terms of the way they look at things, in terms of the way they think about things, and hopefully they go on and do great things down the line. And it would be really rewarding to just sit back and say that, okay, I was part of that journey, right?
Yeah.
Or I enabled some of those things.
Yeah. I have this feeling that around that age, that's when you're so open to information.
And you're smart enough to sort of analyze it. It's not like when you're a teenager, where everything is like emotional and driving you, right? And you're not just reacting. Now you still have a chance to steeping in that idea or thinking about things a little more deeply.
But you're willing to learn new tools as well. You're willing to put in the energy and the effort to learn new things. I mean, I think generally, if you had to average things out, it'd be more difficult to bring the mindset of a 40-year-old into your classroom and tell them, this is how you use Python. Like,
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of like this. I like what kind of analogy? It's like you have this piece of clay, and as it, initially it's very soft and it molds and molds and it forms this shape of whatever person you become to be. But at that age, you're still kind of soft, and you're
and
sort
malleable,
of malleable, and you're hardening into something like.
Yep.
Maybe that's a bad analogy, but I feel like it's
a pretty good analogy, right? I mean, it's your advisor is sort of like your sculptor, or not just your advisor, but whoever you interact with.
Yeah.
During that age, because as a researcher, you're always trying to learn something. You're always trying to think and analyze things, right? And that itself sort of shapes a big deal for a big part.
Yeah. That's yeah. I think that's interesting how this goes also into like how our experiences kind of shape the way we think. Yeah.
To me, as a student at this point, I think I like that aspect of the PhD a lot more than even some of the problems we're trying to solve. Right? Because you sort of look at a problem, you solve it, or you find a solution, you write a paper, you move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
But sort of what remains is the person you are now. Right? So it's sort of all of these things that you learned along the way, and all of these things that you did not learn along the way, which is what remains. Right? The paper is there, yes, but it's the human being that's been shaped through that process.
Yeah.
And it almost becomes like the journey is more important than the destination at that point.
But I think that's the whole. I think that would be a good message to give future people who are inclined towards doing a PhD. I'd say, it's not about going there and getting a degree.
Yeah.
I think it's more about, I think, getting into an ecosystem where you're able to learn from people who are experts in the field, and having the support structure to pursue your interests. Let's say, I think if you see it that way, then you don't think about as much about like, oh, it's going to take 5 years of my life. I'm going to be a grad student, and I'm not going to, like my friends are making so much money, and
and they're partying.
Yeah, and partying, and they have so much free time, and I'm frustrated all the time. But I think as a maybe philosophy, to sort of have this sense of awareness where you know what's going on, but also sort of cherishing the time you have doing it, in some sense, because I think that's something you appreciate more and more as you grow, and you start to look back into things, and you find that, oh, you could do things differently. Maybe I should have been more aware, like I was at the time of my life, I should have done, right, this and that and X and Y. So if you're consciously sort of reminding yourself that you're aware of where you are, which
and
stage why you're doing this, at which stage of your life you are in, I think it could translate more into feeling a sort of sense of peace, that actually enjoy this process and anything that comes with it. And I'm fine now, with what I'm doing.
I think it's a sense of getting into a particular state of mind, which is really helpful. And that's what you I mean, it's nice to have a PhD at the end of it, and being able to put a doctor or PhD at the end of your name.
Yeah.
But it's almost like a way of life on some level.
Yeah.
And if you do it from a good place, and if you have a good advisor, and you have a good ecosystem, then that literally changes the trajectory for the rest of your life.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, it's not just like, it's not a be all end all kind of thing.
Right.
Or
and
is it?
I also think that a good chunk of the PhD is so much inward facing that you're the only one working on that problem, and it's your journey to take, right? Yeah. Your advisor is there to guide you along. Your peers are there to join you for the ride, but at the end of the day, it's a very personal thing that you are doing it, and you sort of reconcile or sort of say that, okay, I've signed up for this. And that gives you a lot of strength, I feel. It's a lot of mental pressure, but it gives you a lot of strength as well for later on in life, when you sort of know that, okay, I'll be all right, or I know how to take care of these things.
But it's because it's difficult. I mean, it's not it's not a well-defined. I mean, you wouldn't be doing research if everything you're doing is well-defined and has a budget and a time frame. Like
it's weirdly real life, but with still some training wheels on. Where you're still allowed to make some mistakes, where you're still sort of guarded by this person who's like a semi or a pseudo parent, where you're still allowed to make mistakes and learn, but the ramifications are not really bad. You're still on a budget, you're still on everything, but you're still in training, so you get a hall pass.
And even more so, the mistakes themselves are encouraged. Like doing the mistakes are encouraged because the advisors or your mentors or pseudo parents understand the process. They've been through it. They know how frustrated they have been doing the experiments and trying to solve the problems. But at the end of it, they always learn. The important part is, what is the takeaway? What do you learn from these things? And sort of be introspective about the progress that you're doing or the lack of, constantly question, your own progress in a sense, and try to figure out what lessons you can take, as opposed to just, bashing your head against the wall over and over. It's like, this should work. Why is this not working? Why is this not working? So I think that's also part of the process, that I think researchers in general are good at asking questions, but also highly introspective people, I think, in general.
You learn to listen.
Yes, you learn to listen. You learn to understand that things are not certain. And you just sort of accept that, like.
And it's okay to change your mind, right?
Definitely,
I mean, with new results, you do approach a problem with a hypothesis, but you're ready to discard that hypothesis in view of new results, which I think is useful to live in society at large. I mean, to begin with, people thought that the earth was flat, but then you get new information and then that's disproven, and now you're like, okay, I have to change what I believe in now because there's new information.
You'd hope people would do that today, but
but one sort of final point I think about being able to do a PhD is it gives you those 5 extra years to yourself. Because if you think about it, you get a bachelor's degree where you're still having fun, you're still a kid. Master's is in between, and you go do a job, at which point 8 to 10 hours of your life are given to a company or to the job, which might not directly have meaning to your own life. What some people do have good jobs where it's meaningful to them as to what job they're doing. But a PhD that way gives you a fixed period of 5 years where you know that you get to spend time on yourself, to improve yourself, to get better, to understand yourself. Because yes, it's mentally demanding, but I find that a lot of people don't really know who they are, or they've not been given the chance to figure out who they are. So doing that PhD sort of really puts you all alone to become intimate with yourself and figure out how you tick. Like, okay, what will upset me? What makes me happy? How can I cheat myself? How can I trick myself?
I think that's a great point. And I think that boils down to the notion that, like, you're in control of your own process. You're the boss of your own projects. You're the boss of yourself. So along the way you're working, you're also realizing what you could do to improve the way you're working. And it's like the more you give into it, the more it will take. So then you'd also sort of try to figure out, where do you stop? Where are your limits, in some sense? Because I think, like, that's because academia, there's just more work than time.
It's an endless supply.
It's an endless supply. And so I think that's why professors are experts at time management. I mean, really great professors are excellent at time management because they just have more on their plate than time to address everything, and that's also why many of them just write really short emails.
Yeah.
But I mean, to going back to this, what you were saying, I think that's an excellent point. For me personally, I can say I learned a lot about myself when I was doing research. Coming in as a naive master student, just oh, this is so cool, I want to work with antennas, and then just taking more and more and more, and then you realize that no, that's maybe not how I want to do things. I mean, that could happen, I guess, like if let's say if you're a recent graduate and you go into a company, you're sort of molded into their way of thinking, right? Or you're sort of molded into the company culture.
Right.
And in some sense, you are within your research group as well, right? But I guess maybe it's more individual. Like the kind of progress, the kind of mindset that you develop is more individual than learning the ropes or being within a big group of people who are communicating a company's vision, let's say. Yeah. And so maybe that also is also, I think, a reason as to why PhD holders are tough cookies. I mean, they're tough people to hire because of this reason that they're very individual. Like they have developed a resistance generally towards notions or towards
right. and towards sort of a herd mentality.
Yeah.
And at the same time, most of them have their what I like calling a bullshit meter. They have this BS meter which sort of tings or rings where you're like, I know you're saying something, but something just doesn't seem right about what you're saying.
Yeah.
And yeah, at the same time, yeah, they know their value, I guess, or they know the value of their time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's could be some. I mean, it could be a double-edged sword in some sense, because
Right.
you might be the own oppressor. Like you can oppress yourself, but you can also put boundaries on yourself to grow within a company structure, because you simply don't accept the values, or you don't align with the vision, or you don't like communicating with certain people because you find that the conversations are not stimulating or in depth.
Yeah. But it's also like, suppose you're a mathematician. I think that's one thing that I like, that you're speaking your own language, and there's this pleasure that you get when you're able to talk to that person in that particular language. I don't know if I'm making sense, but it's almost like fan fiction on some level, right? So if you have Lord of the Rings and they have a language that they've created in Lord of the Rings, and you find somebody else who also speaks that language, there's this joy that you find when you meet somebody else who speaks your language. So getting a PhD in a particular subject is somewhat similar, where you feel happy that you can talk at that length, at that depth with somebody.
True.
You might not want to do it all day long, but there's some happiness in knowing that you can speak to somebody else. And it's a very limited club that does that.
Yeah. I think yeah, that's I think that's cool that you say that. My view has been a little bit more like cynical. That I felt that it's a bit annoying sometimes that there are just 200, 300, or maybe 10 people who just understand what you're doing. I don't know, but
you would want your outreach to be more, but I get that point as well. I completely understand.
I mean, it's very easy to relate to people who play sports. It's very easy to have an opinion about, I don't know, soccer players, because it's so easy to understand, if the basic mechanics of it, like, the most goals win, it's super easy to understand. And that's why I think it has such a wide reach, just because of the simplicity of the fundamentals of it. And so I think that is why it's so maybe also challenging, or very less true within academics, that they are widely known, let's say, among the public, simply because of the bar to entry to
right.
understand what they're doing is
But that was the first point that we spoke about, right? If academics make it such that what they're doing is accessible, so like people like Richard Feynman, He has a Nobel Prize in physics, but the way he describes fire is not only enthusiastic and is not on. He practically describes it like a dance between carbon and oxygen atoms that's going on, and then he says that's fire. So there's a way in which he presents this information,
Definitely,
and it sort of draws you in. So I think if more and more academics were able to do that, I'm not sure if we can give soccer a run for the money, but it's definitely going to be more than 10 people.
Yeah, and there are people who's their jobs are just to communicate science. They even call themselves science communicators. People like Bill Nye, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Dawkins, like these people are popular or very widely known simply because they are good at communicating, let's say, complex subjects to a wide. And that's a respectable skill. That's a really good skill that they have, I think. Even though they might not have this, continuous stream of publication, they're more spending more of their time and effort into educating the public about these, so they get more screen time on TV.
But I think the way to latch people on is to provide a question which somebody wants to solve, or to pique somebody's curiosity to find out why. So as an academic, if you want to pitch your work or anybody's work, if you're sort of able to generate that curiosity or sort of create that atmosphere where it bothers the listener if they don't know what the answer is to the question,
I see.
Then you can sort of hook them in. And academics don't have time for that.
We're too busy trying to figure out nature itself.
Right. On some level.
Yeah.
Because then it becomes a game, and then if you have an ego, then you don't want to concede the fact that what you're looking at is something so simple and beautiful that you can reduce it to such a form that anybody can understand. And I feel that some academics have that ego where they don't want to reduce their work, because then they will have to admit to themselves that it's a very simple thing indeed at the end of the day.
Well, I think I actually disagree with that, because I think being able to reduce your problem into something simple tells you about the novelty of the work itself. If you know what I mean. Being able to solve simple problems is actually, if no one else has done it before, then people will be asking
No, so I guess my point was more towards being big-hearted enough to admit or say, okay, we found this simplistic solution to this hard problem. I think I should have said it that way.
Yeah.
But I agree with what you're saying.
If you can find a really simple problem that no one has done before, I think that's the best problem to solve.
Low-hanging fruits.
Yeah, no, not low-hanging fruits. It's basically the roots of the tree, The low-hanging fruits is like after, this is becoming a hot area now, people are starting to do it, and then they find, I don't want to go into specific fields, but, there are several low-hanging fruits within, let's say, machine learning that people are, for example, doing.
Right.
But the people who built the roots might have defined the problem itself as something very simple, like talking about Jeffrey Hinton. His basic idea was just that, we have these neurons in our brain, and so how can we simulate the same process in a computer? Just the fundamental question of that he's trying to address is inherently simple. I mean, the question itself is easy to understand. Or the problem, I guess.
So that sort of takes me on a tangent where I was thinking about this the other day.
Yeah.
With neural networks, you're sort of trying to recreate the human mind or the brain with the neurons.
Yeah.
And the other day I was looking at these artificial insects that people had made. The smallest flying drones is what they call it. The lightest weight drones. So I don't know what the nervous system of insects look like, but those are really tiny in size, and they do really complex maneuvering at pretty good speeds. Like if one has ever tried to swat a fly, it's really hard.
Yeah.
Swatting a mosquito is still possible, but maybe if you try to recreate that neural network of so-called of a mosquito, maybe there's something else there as well, something that's different.
Yeah. I'm trying
It's
to.
just a weird idea.
No, but I see what you're saying. I think it's you know, I don't want to speak too much out of my element here, but because things I don't understand well. But I mean, if you look at how neurons, let's say you can imagine a tree of neurons. Let's say, maybe you can recreate the image of that tree. You can recreate how the neurons are, or simulate sort of how the neurons would look like in an insect, in a fly's brain, let's say. But then the way these neurons fire and the interactions between these neurons are, I think that's where the complexity lies. That's where like the insect itself, that's the way these things interact is something that the insect has developed over the course of its evolution.
So my question was more towards, does it have, I don't know if it has a neural system similar to what humans have.
Yeah.
It has a completely different system,
Hmm.
which, like you said, through evolution is specialized for something else.
Yeah.
Can we mimic or recreate that completely new system?
I think that should be probably the answer to that is probably yes. I mean,
if we've got neural networks working, then something else should be.
If we can, I mean, if an insect can do it, then why can't a computer do it? I mean, in theory, it should work, right?
I guess, yeah. We've got quantum computers in practice now, and they were only theory some time back. So
yeah, quantum computers are. I had a discussion about this with another, the guy who did some work on qubits. And we got into why quantum computers are not, like, even people who do research or experts in quantum computing would be hesitant to say that this is going to work. But the way they apply for funding, to be able to get the funding to keep doing research within the area, they have to sort of say that quantum computing is going to work. I mean, maybe not state that, but somehow hint that this is a very exciting area that you should be investing in.
Right.
But inherently, they likely to know that, or likely to think that, there's a chance it won't work at all. Like might be a dead end, But you won't tell that to investors. You don't want them to.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. So I think maybe as a final note, about the PhD itself, you're 2 years in. Could you mention a little bit about the kind of work that you're doing? I think this entire conversation we've talked about everything else except the work.
Because we started off with being a specialized generalist, right?
Yeah.
So the conversation is very general.
Yeah, but that's actually the way I think it's actually more fun that it just evolved this way, and it wasn't at all discussing, it wasn't specific points to follow in that sense, just
right. So when I started for my master's, we worked on visible light communication or visible light sensing. So I built some receiver boards that were able to detect shadows on the floor from light bulbs that were mounted on ceilings. So the idea was you just screw in a light bulb on the ceiling, and from the light bulb, you're able to detect shadows of people underneath.
I see.
And given the information of these spots in a particular room on the floor have shadows, you can sort of infer how many people are there, what activities they're doing, where they're standing or sitting or moving, and things like that. So you could do indoor positioning, localization, and tracking.
So using light sensors to detect changes in basically light intensity that comes from having shadows.
Right.
walking around, or people walking around who cast shadows on these sensors, and then somehow
No,
you're
they
able.
don't cast shadows on the sensors. The sensors are also in the light bulb.
Ah, okay.
So
So is it
it was
reflections you're looking?
yes.
Okay, okay.
So it was interesting. It was an interesting research problem because usually you have a sensor and then the shadow or light or whatever, or the light intensity falls on the sensor.
Mm.
But what we tried to do was detect if there was a change in light intensity from somewhere far away.
I
In
see.
this case, from the source of light itself.
Ah. So what could you infer? Could you infer this?
Yeah. So you would have you'd look at the light level on the floor, and then you check back those spots of the floor if there's a change in light level. So you sort of refresh. It's like a screen refreshing, but you're refreshing the screen, the floor.
I see.
And you look for changes in light intensity on the floor. So when there's nobody and all the lights are on, let's say it's 500 lumens.
Yeah.
Or 350 lumens. But then when somebody walks and there's a shadow on the same spot, it's maybe 200 lumens now. So the sensor is able to detect the 350 or 400 or 500 lumens before and the 250.
That's interesting. But is there a margin of error in the sense, let's say the height of a person?
Right. So the interesting things would be the height of the person, what colored clothes they're wearing.
Yeah.
Because if somebody is wearing a black colored shirt, they're reflecting much less.
Yeah.
And what the color of the floor is, right? So if you have a white surface, then that's going to reflect a lot more.
Yeah.
But if you have a dark carpet, then how do you detect dark shadows on a dark carpet? So those were some of the research questions that we sort of solved. And we made one particular board and a photo sensor, basically, which could detect these.
I see.
For a big range of surfaces.
That's interesting. And how would that, as a if you would, let's say, try to
sell it to someone?
Yeah. What would your pitch be? Why is this something that's interesting as a research direction that you?
It's interesting because now you don't need cameras.
Yeah.
And it's really privacy conserving. Right? And physical objects have shadows. So if there is a human being in the room, they're definitely going to cast a shadow. So it would be really hard to spoof somebody being there or not being there. Right? Because it's a function of how tall they are, whether they have a bald spot on their head, whether they're wearing a reflective jacket, a dark jacket, whatever. There's no cameras, and we made it such that these photo sensors were part of the light bulbs themselves. So you could go to the store, let's say buy a Philips light bulb, or buy whatever bulb that one would buy, LED bulb, and then just screw that in, and just screwing the light bulb in is deploying the sensor.
Yeah. And how would you receive this information then?
So over Wi-Fi. So
over Wi-Fi.
It's just like your smart bulb, which connects to your Wi-Fi at home, and you have control over it on an app.
Yeah.
So it's on the same network.
I see. So I imagine that someone. So this is of course given that the robber, or if you have a scenario where there's, let's say, someone who is trying to break into your house. It would be likely that they wouldn't turn on the light.
At night, yes.
Yeah, I was just joking, but I mean,
but that is a legitimate drawback, right?
Yeah.
Where if there are no lights on, then the system is not technically on, unless you sort of calibrate it with the light from outside if it's coming through the window or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, you've already found out how to rob a place, I guess, where these sensors are.
But you could also imagine this could be incorporated in different kinds of mediums, not restricted to light, right? It could be temperature changes, it could be vibrational sensors, it could be different.
But most of those would need deployment on the floor.
Yeah.
Which means you'll have to deploy these sensors, wiring, power source, all of that. But if it's with the light bulb, then all of that's already taken care of. People already have places where you can screw the light bulb in. It's wired to have power. Like everything is taken care of.
Yeah.
And it's just a minor modification to the light bulb itself.
That's true. If that doesn't, if that could be developed into a product, let's say if you manage to have a very low cost system or very low.
I would do that for smart homes.
Yeah.
Where the light bulb itself sort of detects you walking into the room or something and turning the light on.
Yeah.
So you have this ambient light where suppose you open your front door and there's a light outside, even at night. So the street light or whatever goes in. So the light bulb sort of figures out, okay, this person's come home. Let me turn this light on. And then you sort of have contextual information that, okay, he's walked into the kitchen. So let me turn only the kitchen on. Right now, you probably would have to say, hey, Google or hey, Siri or whatever, like turn the lights on.
Yeah. Speaking of, as a final question, I'm wondering if you have the angle, the incident angle of where a person is standing. If you have a regular light bulb, then you can, of course, the light is sort of scattered. So then, in practice, you'd have reflections
from all over.
All over.
The photo sensor is only looking at one point. We made it point to a particular spot on the floor.
Okay.
So you could look at it. You could think of them as cones. So suppose you had a grid.
Yeah.
Let's say 6x6.
Yeah.
And on let's say 1,1, 2,2, 3,3 points. You had these. So you'd have these cones which are sensing cones. Over where the sensing occurs.
Interesting.
So I think that was the time I met you in Salt Lake City. That's where we presented this. This was 2017.
I have a pretty bad memory.
For Mobicom.
Yeah,
that was the first time I went to a Mobicom.
Yeah.
And then after that, that was my master's thesis as well. So we sort of I wrote that up in a document which is available. So anybody can look up the thesis and build that sensor for themselves. It's about 70 pages and it has plots and diagrams and the PCB design and everything. So the idea was, so the thing my advisor told me was, if I pick up somebody on the street and give them this document, they should be able to not only build your sensor, but get the same graph that you plotted on in your thesis.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's a different debate in itself. I think there's a lot of problems with
reproducibility, but we don't need to go into that.
Yeah, but I'd like to say I think maybe we could wrap up here and say thank you for
thank you for taking time.
Yeah, no, of course, it's a very interesting conversation, and for that you participate and share your insights and experiences. That's great, and I hope this conversation would be useful not only to us but to somebody else.
Hopefully somebody who's either brave enough or stupid enough to want to do it. After listening to this conversation.
Well, there could definitely be much worse content they could tune into. So
at least we have nice backgrounds, right? I mean, we have like the Golden Gate, and then what I'm assuming is Stockholm.
Yeah, that's Stockholm on a beautiful summer day. Yeah. All right. What thank you again for
thank you for having me. And I'm glad that you thought my opinions would be useful.
Yeah, I think it definitely will. I learned stuff. So I hope others will too. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
See you.